So welcome back, everyone. Before we get started with the last hour of the class or a little more, I wanted to just catch you up on a few things. So next week, you will be reading the first three parts of the City Revisited, and we will be talking particularly about the New York and the Los Angeles schools of urban studies, and inevitably, to some extent, how they differ from the Chicago school and why schools or theories are important. Um, and then the week after that, Terry Clark and Steve Corey will be with us to talk about sociology and history and how those approaches allow us to understand the city. And so next week, then we read The City Revisited, and the week following, you start on the book Scenescapes, so that we can get into those discussions and what they have to offer as a different approach. What you can see already in the first 3 weeks is probably no one person is able to understand everything about cities and put it in a simple package, so that each of us discover a different part of the urban story and do a different level of research to prove that the story is accurate and present it as best we can. And then we attempt in the schools, in a sense, to synthesize it. So what you'll be doing in your paper, and I'll come in to do with more detail next week, is to try and put together what contribution you might be able to make in terms of a research design of what you would do if you were doing a full study of some aspect of the Chicago metropolitan region or the Chicago experience, or how you might use the Chicago school approach to study some other city and some other place in the country or in the world. And so I just wanted to, before Missy picks up the story of metropolitanization and globalization, pick up the sort of key points that the 21st Century Chicago book tries to make, and that is, in covering the social conditions of the city and the region, we find that the most unifying thread, or the punchline of the social conditions and challenges, is the connection between race and poverty in metropolitan Chicago. In terms of the economic condition or economic challenges, we find that this vast transformation, which Missy has partly covered today, moving from a manufacturing city to a service economy, to finally the global economy and what that means for the life of the city, the region, and the individuals living here, is the main theme of the economic transformation. And so one of the things in terms of the political that Connie covered last week, the most enduring theme in Chicago history is a particular kind of political agency, but the specifics of the political machine and how it has influenced the history of Chicago in the way, for instance, it has not influenced Los Angeles. And last of all, with government, which Missy is still covering as she covers metropolitanization and globalization, the governmental conditions of the region is fragmentation and the existence of 19th century kinds of governments trying to cope with 21st century problems. And the various essays and contributions in the 21st Century Chicago book contribute to that. And we began today with the metropolitanization and the globalization. And Missy, I will turn it back over to you for that story.
If I had a spare minute, I would like to map out the trajectory of the Chicago machine into the suburbs, because there's a direct connection. It's sort of fanned out the same way that suburbanization did. I live in a very machine run suburb, but it's sort of fanned out in the same way. But spare minute is not something I'm familiar with. So. Okay, so the history lesson is almost over, I assure you. um, there's an important reason, sort of for bringing this up and going over the minutia, which we don't really go over in the book, but that's to, as Dick said, to show you that the enduring, social issue, the enduring um, problem really facing the region is that connection between race and class, but there is structure after structure that is built on top of it that exacerbates it. When Cicero was incorporated, for instance, there were not that many blacks living in the north. There were a few, right? The first Great Migration begins after the Civil War. But in Cicero, if you were a black family and you moved in, they would burn you out, smoke you out, beat you out, do whatever they had to do in order to get you out. Cicero was not for you. Berwyn was not for you either. I actually live in a ward with the first black alderman ever in Berwyn, in a town where, just 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a family moved in and they were, their house was vandalized and they were threatened to the point where they moved out. Scott.
You'd mentioned about sunset laws in Cicero. A friend of mine had a firsthand experience with Cicero's sunset laws back in the 1960s. He was white. He had asked a couple of subordinates at this warehouse he worked at to, stay late and get some stuff done. And they protested, we can't be here after sundown. And he said, well, afterwards, I'll walk you to the L station. And they got intercepted by a cop car. The cop, started yelling at them. And when my friend explained, oh, I just had them work late, I'm walking to the station, he shoved them all into a cop car, drove them to the L station. Meanwhile, he's berating my friend the whole time, you can't do that here, et cetera, et cetera.
People say those things, and I feel like more than a few have said, well, that's just Cicero, or that's just one example, but it's not. It's the way that a lot of these suburbs, especially white ethnic suburbs, operated for many years with not the implicit approval of the governmental structure or the policing, but the explicit, as you mentioned. So thank you for sharing that story. Approval. And so the interesting thing is today Cicero is 90% Latinx. So the white ethnic machine that occupied, they still run the government, but that lived in that city is almost gone. A great amount of change happened in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, so completely locking out Black Americans from living in these neighborhoods. That hyper sort of individualism, that hyper sort of self-determination wasn't just like Oak Park doesn't want to be part of Cicero, so they're going to incorporate Forest View, Illinois, which might be the smallest suburb, I'm not sure, incorporated to be a town that was for World War I veterans only. And so there becomes a sort of a suburban mentality of hyper individualism, hyper specialization. I will build the town how I want it. If you don't like it, leave, right? If you don't like it, live somewhere else. And that's like, I don't want to make you have to talk about your philosophy classes like sort of a human nature. But that becomes sort of a prevailing myth then in the suburbs, where that the suburbs incorporate and create their own way of life, and they get to just do it. In the urban literature, right, we talk about the idea of the right to the city, who has the right to the city. Similarly, in the suburbs, who has the rights to that suburb? If I buy my home here in Berwyn, I pay my taxes, I'm a good neighbor, don't I have the same, right as anyone else to live here? I'm a terrible neighbor, I never mow my lawn. So there's a whole other argument there. But the point is that, what is the home? What is the property? What is the difference between, house and home and where you live and how you live? So this urban literature that's centered around sort of the right to exist and agency also applies to a lot of these suburbs as well, because suburbs become a way to lock people out, not just zoning, right? There are extra legal means to do it as well. Between in the period of 1870-ish to about 1920, that pre-World War I, era, we get a lot of suburbs who incorporate themselves as a, sort of a reaction to the city. I don't want the city to annex me or to incorporate, so I'm going to create my own. And then a host of their own laws. Oak Park was a dry town for many years. It still is. You can't have a bar in Oak Park. But Forest Park right next to it then said, hey, we're gonna have bars everywhere, right? So it becomes a patchwork of strange spaces almost that don't make sense. You can go to Forest Park and drink a lot. You can go to Cicero or Stickney and gamble, but then go home to Oak Park where everything is nice and sort of sanitized and clean. And actually that's a little bit of a untrue about Oak Park. It has a different history. But my point is that the hyper segregation and the balkanization of the suburbs does not then lend to any sort of collective identity. Without a collective identity, right, we're not going to work on collective solutions. The suburbs also segregated, repeated, besides zoning, besides sundown towns, economically. Segregated themselves. Harvey was a suburb that was incorporated in 1891 and was mostly white ethnics until a lot of the industry in Northwest Indiana and South Chicago closed up and left. The sorts of panic selling, block busting, that sort of stuff that Connie talked about last class absolutely went on in these suburbs like Dolton and Riverdale and the suburb that I'm from, Glenwood. In the 1980s when people were losing their jobs and they had to move somewhere else. So we moved. My dad couldn't find a job, and so we moved to Glendale Heights, which is in DuPage County. But a lot of people couldn't move. A lot of people were sort of locked in. And so this is what happened to Harvey, right? People abandoned Harvey, as did a lot of the state and the county. And there's no way sort of then how does Harvey recover? It didn't have an economy to replace it. The most the worst sort of example of this, the saddest example of this is Ford Heights. Ford Heights used to be East Chicago Heights, and it incorporated in 1949 to be a suburban oasis for Black families. Suburbs wouldn't let them in. So they said, we will find a place of our own and incorporated East Chicago Heights and then renamed themselves Ford Heights in hopes of getting the Ford stamping plants, which did not move to Ford Heights, which instead moved to Chicago Heights, which until the 1980s, 1990s was majority white and did not let Black families work or let Black families in. And so we have segregation and then hyper segregation brought out and repeated, the same city patterns repeated in the suburbs. Ford Heights has not been able to recover since. There is no industry in Ford Heights. A lot of the people live far below the poverty line. And so Ford Heights has now become the poorest suburb in America. The corruption at the governmental level was so bad in Ford Heights that a fire truck went missing. Fire truck. The police department became essentially a protection for the gangs. Gangs took over Ford Heights, and the police department protected the highest bidder, which gang would pay them more, to the point that the county sheriff's office disbanded Ford Heights Police Department and now patrols Ford Heights. So remember, again, the layering sort of these effects and the divestment from a lot of these municipalities. It's hard enough for the city of Chicago, right, which is very large, 2.7 million people, this huge economy, to take care of its poorest residents. If you are a small municipality of 8,000 people, right, with a very small government, you're relying on the county, you're relying on neighbors, you're relying on state help. And when that's not there, you really have nothing. Ford Heights is doing a little bit better today, but still ranks as the poorest suburb in America. This leads me to DuPage County. I'm taking a liberty there. I've talked a little bit about DuPage County. DuPage County is an odd one. It was like a small rural farmland, most of it really until probably 30 or 40 years ago. But its population exploded because of that cheap land, the construction of 88, 290, 53, 355, all of these highways, which again helped decant and distill not just people from the city, but people from the inner rung suburbs of Cook County. As the inner rung suburbs started to become older, the infrastructure started to become weaker, people said, I don't want to live here anymore. I want to live somewhere farther out. This is how suburbanization continues to move to mushroom to why urbanists call it sprawl, right? Because it just keeps sort of marching outward. If you look at particularly between 1940 and 1980, remember that's that boom burb era. DuPage County is 6 times the size that it was. DuPage County was financed by FHA mortgages, financed by federal highway transportation dollars, and then later the state of Illinois, and financed by Chicago jobs, by jobs in Chicago. People worked in Chicago and then they went home to DuPage County, right, to spend their money, to invest their money. And so DuPage County really owes its entire existence to the city of Chicago. It could not have been built. It could not have been inhabited. Naperville, which is now the 3rd largest city in Illinois, was 30,000 people in 1980. It's now 180,000. So it just goes to show you how fast these populations have grown. DuPage County is an interesting suburb to, or interesting place to study, because what we know about a lot of these suburbs, particularly the suburbs that are outside of Cook County, or if we're talking Los Angeles outside of LA County, such as Orange County, or if we're talking about Atlanta, some of the counties outside of Atlanta, is that because it's a disproportionate share of white rich people, there is a disproportionate share of Republicans. And so DuPage County for many years voted Republican. Actually, it was the heart of Republican policy, as many of the, Lee Daniels, Pate Phillips, who ran the state house for the this amount of time in the past 40 years that Republicans were allowed to do anything in the state house, came from DuPage County. So DuPage County as an entity, right, it has money, it has Republican voters, and it is reliably sort of Republican. One of the most Republican counties. Around 1990, right, maybe a little bit before, all of a sudden people in DuPage County started voting blue. Why is that? They just changed their mind and they start voting blue. We'll look at a couple of slides with some of the political activity since then. The blue obviously is Democrats, and the Republican, I'm sorry, that's not a very good red, it's more of an orange, but you can see that the percentage of the Democratic vote has increased all the way until 2012, when we have a shift. In 2016, DuPage County votes blue. Does anyone know the percentages for Biden? Or could you guess what the percentage for Joe Biden's vote was in 2020, if we're looking at these trends?
55.
Close, yes. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton beats Donald Trump, right? She gets over 50% of the vote. Joe Biden gets 58% of the vote, and Donald Trump only gets 40% of the vote. That's a huge change. If you would have told me, a kid going to high school in Glendale Heights, 25 years ago, that this was going to happen, I would have thought you were crazy. So it's not just at the presidential level. So what I did is, when you start to hear stories like Hillary Clinton won, this Democrat got elected, you want to look at the data. And so to compile this article, I tried to find sort of a proxy for how many Democrats were in DuPage County, or how people were voting. And so the first thing I looked at was the presidential vote, to see how the presidential vote was changing. So this tells us a lot. This tells us that, it's shifting, and the 2020 results sort of confirm what we knew in 2016, which is that it was changing. The governor's level too, I thought, well, okay, national politics is one thing, right? State politics are talking about a host of different issues. Is it possible that the same trend is occurring at the gubernatorial level, and it is. It looks like, right, DuPage County is voting more Democrat than it is Republican. A change, right, from 2014 to 2018. Say, okay, well, the presidential level, the gubernatorial level, what could that possibly mean for offices on the ground? Because state and local politics are, it's not this defense and, these big hard-hitting issues like they are at the federal level. Could it be the same at the local level as well? And so I apologize, this slide is super crowded, but for anyone that follows DuPage politics, even in 2010, if you said this was going to be the slide I was showing you, someone would fall out of their chair. What I looked at were the state races. So for the Illinois General Assembly, for the House, and then for the Senate, who won in 2018 and who won in 2020. By 2018, we could say that DuPage County was mostly Democrat, right? We have 1, 2, 3 state senators, and these are districts that are wholly or vast majority in DuPage County. 3, excuse me. And then a majority of the state House seats that are Democrat. That's a huge change. And so in 2018, everyone was saying blue wave, blue wave, blue wave in DuPage. It would be a blue wave if those results held in 2020, and what we know from the presidential results, right? 58 to 40%, right, for Biden. But also, we have essentially, right, similar results. DuPage County finally gets what Chicago has had for decades, and that is a Democrat who ran unopposed. Again, 20 years ago, if you would have said DuPage County has a Democrat that's running unopposed, nobody would believe you. DuPage County has been jealous of Cook County for a long time because of that. They had plenty of Republicans that ran unopposed. So Deb Conroy, who was the first Democrat to be elected at the state rep level, runs unopposed. And we see essentially the same split that we saw previously. What's interesting to note about the House and Senate races in DuPage is that they are increasingly not white and they are increasingly female. So it was a good year for women in 2018. Mostly women won these seats, but also in 2020. In 2020, in the 25th Senate district, Karina Villa, whose parents are Mexican, wins a state Senate district, so this district is interesting. It's not, it's only part of it's in DuPage. The other part's in Kane County, St. Charles, Geneva, Batavia, pretty conservative areas who vote for her. And she's very, pro public education, pro union, that sort of stuff. We also have some people who again, like more incorporation, more political incorporation. Ken Mejia Beal is a Black man who is gay, who is married, who has the name of his spouse, who loses to Amy Grant. But the person who ran against Amy Grant in 2018 lost by more. So Ken makes some inroads, right, into this district. Ann Stava Murray is a self-proclaimed socialist, democratic socialist, who's come out very much in favor of Bernie Sanders type policies, and she wins an area that is Glen Ellen, part of Wheaton and Downers Grove. So again, super conservative areas. And she did it really by knocking on a lot of doors. So why, right, why? I think we're used to a similar type of story or a similar explanation for why the city votes the way it does, or why inner rung suburbs vote the way that they do. I joke that where I live, even the pets are Democrat, right? There's so many Democrats. But in these outer rung areas, and remember, Orange County, similar, areas around Atlanta, Georgia, similar, suburban counties in New York, similar. It's changing. And so the first thing we want to do when we look at the explanations is sort of root it in the literature and see if we can find an explanation that way. Is anyone familiar with, and bonus points, V.O. Key's notion of secular shift? Sounds so good in the halls of COD, trust me. A secular shift is essentially a change in who is voting and the people who are voting, right? So we don't have a critical election or a realigning election, something that would change parties. Instead, what we have is an electorate that itself has changed over time. So interestingly, DuPage, the people who live in DuPage have simply become more democratic. In the past 20 to 30 years, who lives in DuPage? The people who tend to vote Democrat. And who tends to vote Democrat? Here's a softball. Who tends to vote Democrat?
Are they non-Christian? Secular,
Uh,
non-Christian? Is that why we're talking about secular shifts, I'm guessing?
So secular actually has nothing to do with religion. We use the term because we mean it doesn't have to do with necessarily the politic issues themselves.
Hmm.
Sean, were you going to say?
No, I was answering your question as far as who votes Democratic. Typically I do, but I think I'm leaning more independent as of late, but typically in the past I would have voted straight Democratic.
Yeah, I think, if we look at the party's typical base of support, right, we see it's people who are pro-public education or people who are pro-union or people who make a little bit less money. We see it's more non-white than it is white. More women, right, tend to vote Democrat. And so what do we have in DuPage County is sort of a shift of the people who live there. Remember I talked about people coming from the city, but also people coming from the inner rung suburbs of Cook County and bringing their politics with them, right? So that explains it. That explains actually a whole bunch of it. When I spoke with some of the elected officials, in order to write that, what they said they basically confirmed sort of the same thing, is that, a lot of people are moving from Berwyn, from Evanston, from wherever, and bringing their politics with them. Another explanation is very favorable mapping. Mike Madigan rewarded DuPage County, there's some more Mike Madigan, rewarded DuPage County by drawing maps, by packing in Democrats into districts, right, to make it easier for them to get elected. This happens to the point where Democrats win at the local level as well. The DuPage County Board is now majority Democrat. A rejection of Trumpism. DuPage Republicans are not, they're not Trump-like Republicans. They're far more liberal. More women and lots of money, right? I'm sure you've heard plenty of times before that it's money that is driving a lot of these elections. The Democrats dumped a ton of money into some of these races. The woman who is the state rep over COD, that Glen Ellen area, spent the first time she ran $2 million, over $2 million in order to run for that House seat. I mean, do you want to run for office? $2 million, I would think, United States Congress, not the Illinois House of Representatives. That's a lot of money, to win one and to secure one seat. She spent about the same again. So imagine what that sort of fundraising looks like as well. A lot of union money in DuPage, and then strategy and organizing. Again, this is going on across suburban areas to the point where we can say that the suburbs won the election for Joe Biden. Sound crazy? Brookings did a study after the election where it looked at the effects of suburbanizations, and we've been hearing the term suburbs as swing states for some years now. But some suburbs, it seems like Florida probably is Republican, right? It seems like many suburbs, especially DuPage County, might now be reliably Democrat. So what Brookings did was to look at the vote totals from urban cores, large suburbs, small metro areas, and then non-metro area to see where the difference is. And essentially what they found was that it was in suburban areas where Democrats picked up the most gains. So why does that have such an effect nationally? Well, we live mostly suburban now. The majority of the United States lives in the suburbs. The majority of the United States has changed their voting pattern, and that means it's going to affect, right, what's going on at the national level. Map making and money certainly have an effect, right? But the point is, right, if we drill down to it, that the suburbs now are more important than ever politically. If Democrats want to keep the Senate, if Democrats want to, keep the House, if they want to win against Joe Biden, and at the Illinois level, if Democrats want to maintain these huge gains that they have over Republicans, they're going to have to win in the suburbs. Well, the suburbs are very happy to be so important in that regard. I'm going to skip over this slide. I feel like it's a lot of words, and sort of then come back and have a conversation about metropolitanization. Again, after we've discussed, how Chicago has metropolitanized. What is the price of this growth? What is the price of this shift? What is the price of this swing? Metropolitanization comes at a cost. Sprawl, which I've said several times, means that people are not, and so this may sound basic or pedestrian, but I want you to think about it again in terms of what I've said. So core loss, right? People not living in the city, people moving further and further out. There are effects of that alone. In our suburban loss with development farther and farther, we are abandoning the places that we used to, right, build, the places that we used to refurbish, the places that that used to mean something to us, and building new spaces. It's a change in ideology, right? It's a change sort of in the way that we are thinking and the way that we're feeling about space and living. It's not worth it anymore to rehab something old or to reinvest in a neighborhood when I can just take this money and buy something new. I'm sure everyone in here has friends or family that's moved to Texas, Arizona, Nevada, right? Which you can buy a house for, a $250,000 house. Where I live in Berwyn is not very much, good luck finding one. But in Texas, you can get 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a yard, probably a community swimming pool. The idea is sort of moving out and building new. It changes the way people feel, and it changes people's connections to their communities. Leapfrog development increases the use of resources. If we're not building compact, right, just building over there because it's cheaper, then I have to drive my car to my job, right, probably farther, and we're not building public transit in order to get me to that. So sprawl is in and of itself can be a bad thing, especially if we don't have ways to manage that sprawl. Think about it, right, in terms of Chicago and Cook County. 129 municipalities in Cook County, 30 plus in DuPage. I didn't even look at Will, Kane, Kendall, so at 150 more if we look at them. School districts, special governments, this multiplication of governments. Why does multiplication of governments affect us negatively? On my property tax bill, I pay to 15 different governments. Scott.
That was just going to be my comment, that when you've got more municipalities, that's more taxing bodies, and the amount of potential pool of potential tax money gets spread thinner that way.
Oh yes, it's not an efficient use of resources. Professor Simpson's favorite example is mosquito abatement districts. I live in the Western Cook County Mosquito Abatement District. I hope that my tax dollars go to serve just this part, and that the mosquitoes and the spray stop at Austin Boulevard, which is the central, right, area for it. and north and south. This sort of thing is ridiculous. I mean, on its face, it sounds ridiculous, but there are institutions built behind it and really people who have an interest in maintaining it that way. My favorite story is one that now Speaker of the House, Chris Welch, told my students when he was just elected to his seat at Dominican. I was at Dominican, he was our state rep, he came in and talked to us. River Forest is a suburb and a township together. Why have both, right? Why not combine the two governments? So he was interested in doing it. The mayor of River Forest was interested in doing it. And so you have to introduce a bill into the General Assembly that would dissolve it. The township of River Forest had 2 employees that outsourced the stuff to Oak Park Township. So they didn't even provide their own services, right? Their job was to sort of outsource these things. When they heard that their jobs were at risk, they knocked on many doors in River Forest, which caused such an outcry from River Forest residents who said, save the township, we need the township. They were able to make this argument. Sort of blew the mind of, Chris Welch, who's a Democrat, but the mayor of River Forest, who was a conservative Republican, and they were like, I don't understand. River Forest is very rich. So for them, $1 or $2 on their tax bill is not a big deal. But the, sort of the lobbying that goes behind keeping that sort of thing, where I live, we talk about it, and they constantly sing for their supper, the township, and make it a reason why they need to stay. But the point is that these resources are not going to who needs them, right? And so they're going to structures that, manage and oversee, and at the end of the day, pensions that multiply this government. So this exacerbates things like residential segregation, unequal tax revenues. If I can take the money that I'm paying to the township and pay it somewhere else, right? Then perhaps I can help something else. But also people segregate themselves based on income. Anyway, River Forest, $1 million homes, right? People who live in River Forest are not going to move to Berwyn. People who live in Berwyn are not going to move to River Forest. Meaning, right, unequal tax revenues for both. What do these property tax revenues pay for then? What is different then? Help see if you can follow sort of where I'm going with this. What then is one of the biggest issues or the biggest differences between River Forest and Berwyn? I'm explaining right. Or let's say River Forest and Fort Heights.
School funding.
School funding, absolutely. The schools in River Forest and Oak Park are much better funded than schools in Berwyn and Cicero. So it has a huge effect. Why do we do it that way? Why do Oak Park's tax dollars stop at Roosevelt? I'm 3 blocks south. I can't have any of them. My schools have to be so different because of that. The high school here can't even afford to put in an air conditioning system because they don't have enough money to do so. A lot of this comes from this multiplication. But remember what I said earlier about identity, right? Berwyn is Berwyn, Oak Park is Oak Park, River Forest is River Forest. Never the 3 shall meet. Regional investments have been skewed disproportionately to the wealthiest suburbs. Yes, Wu.
So River Forest has a better school, but is that because it's more efficient than Berwyn? We have been talking about how one township, one village might be paying more because they're paying this taxing authority, they're paying that taxing authority, and another one, they're not efficient. But we just said one, like schools in Forest Heights, no, school in wherever, River Forest is better than schools in somewhere. And what was the reason? Is that because one is paying fewer taxing authorities than the other?
Does someone want to answer that for him? Be
Daniel,
brave, Daniel.
Because school funding is based on those property taxes are based on a per dollar valuation of the properties in the school district. So if you had two school districts, each of which had 100 properties in them, and this school district, the properties on average cost $1 million, and this school district, the properties on average cost $250,000. This school district's going to have 4 times the money than this one. So our funding is based on the value of the property, not on the number of students, not on the educational needs of the students, not on the human capital needs of the region. Just how much is that land inside the district worth?
so River Forest pays so much more property tax that it doesn't really matter how inefficient they are. They
When you
just pay
say more, are you talking about in dollar value or
Dollar value.
as a percentage of the value? of the
Okay.
property?
So yes, so that I see what I see the confusion. Assume the property tax rate is 5%. Okay. So, my house that's $200,000, right? I'm paying on that. The homes in River Forest are worth $1 million. So 5% of 200,000 and 5% of 1 million are very different. The efficiency, so the state does try and help and equalize some of that, but at the end of the day, it doesn't, having more money, right? And to be fair, right, more money doesn't necessarily translate into, pull your head open and put more knowledge in there. But it certainly does help, to be able to pay teachers adequately, to have, facilities, to be able to have materials and the like. How much does it cost to educate a student? The state has its own formula. But if you have students that have special needs, for instance, districts that have more money, right, can provide more of that. And there is a mismatch, areas that, poor areas tend to have more students that have need, right, than areas that have more money. If your child is developmentally delayed in any way, they can go to preschool, for instance, right, and they go to free preschool. But if you're, a River Forest parent, you're probably not sending your child, right, to that public preschool. You're sending them to some sort of private institution. And so there's more, it's almost a perverse sort of, relationship, which is that these, poorer areas end up having more needs, yet having less money, so more strain on that local government. And then these richer areas have the money. So the money, will go to the elementary and to the high school. And other areas can benefit from it. It's all in how the boundaries are drawn. I went to a very fancy high school in Glen Ellen because part of Glendale Heights, which is very average, was drawn into that district. So it's not a direct correlation between the two, but it's pretty good. Can explain a lot of the variation. The amount of money that, suburbs have to invest in things is skewed again disproportionately to the wealthy suburbs, not just by the suburbs themselves, by the belief that this is where we will find the patrons, right, that can afford it. Am I going to invest in a Starbucks in Ford Heights? Probably not. If I'm building an office incubator, am I going to build it in Ford Heights and the like, right? And so it becomes a self-fulfilling sort of thing. The root of it, right, is this lack of regional cooperation. Why shouldn't we work together? Why shouldn't these communities work together? When I did my dissertation, I interviewed about 20 mayors and I asked them this question outright. We live in a metropolitan area, right? We need to work together. That's the only way we're going to survive. How, right, do you work together? Do you work together with your neighbors? Of course, they all told me yes, right? Because I'm writing this down in a big, huge thing that 6 people will read. I watched one mayor tell me, yes, I cooperate with my neighboring suburb, and then 2 years later, poach businesses, right, from that suburb, because there is this idea of self-determination, of self sort of my suburb first, right? Remember what I said about identity, going all the way back to the 1860s. There is no metropolitan citizen. We don't see ourselves as metropolitan citizens. I make a lot of jokes about Cicero and Oak Park, but at the end of the day, there's not that much difference between, me and that tax rates, yes, for sure. But we're all, like Cook County residents. Perhaps the inner ring suburbs have a certain identity that's different than the city. But the notion that, 3 blocks makes me that much different than someone from Oak Park is kind of funny. And so I'm going to this detail because without an identity, right? The idea that, Oak Park is my neighbor and Cicero is my neighbor and we'll work together. People are not going to let their money go into one pot to pay for all the problems. This is a problem with suburbs versus city as well, right? Suburbanites, DuPage County, people who live in DuPage County, do they want their money going into the city to help with their problems? The average, the median income in DuPage County is $92,000. The median income in Cook County is $65,000. So again, right, think what I said about balkanization sort of and hyper segregation. This goes for housing. Where do we put the low-income housing? Some suburbs have done a very good job of making zoning laws to prevent low-income housing from ever coming that way. So where do people live? Part of the reason I live in Berwyn is that I cannot afford DuPage County. It'd be very easy for me to live in Glen Ellen, wake up, go to class, get there in 2 minutes. There's not a chance I could afford to live. Maybe 2 of the suburbs, but it would be just as far. I'm not poor. I make a good living, but there's no way that I could afford. So again, this sort of hyper, and I drive my car, right? Because there's no good public transit out there because people don't see sort of a need or a want or any sort of benefit from it. Social services, which we'll get to in a second, and then education, which we covered. I'm going to go to the poverty slide first, since we sort of touched on it.
We should just try to dissolve a town and annex it to the Chicago area or whatnot. Then
we're going to annex River Forest and call it all Berwyn. How do we then address poverty, right? So you've discussed, and we discussed last class about, poverty in Chicago. How do we then address poverty across these multiple jurisdictions, right? If you're poor and you need assistance with housing, where do you go? Does anyone know in the city, where do you go?
The Housing Authority?
Yep, Chicago Housing Authority. The City of Chicago Department on Human Services, I believe, also has an agency. If you are in suburban Cook County, you can go to your township. I should quit ripping on townships. You can also go to a county agency in DuPage County if you need help with housing. There's a couple little local places, but it's really hard to find help. If you need help applying for food stamps or for temporary aid to needy families, the City of Chicago can help, right? The City of Chicago has departments that can help you. Cook County has departments that can help you. In DuPage County, there's not really anyone that can help you. But anyway, so let me step back a second. How do we, who is best? Let me ask this really loaded, open-ended question. Who is best to address poverty in the Chicago metropolitan region? Sean.
From my understanding, the government is not equipped properly to handle such things. So this is why we have 501c3s, not-for-profits, that are typically tasked with like human service needs or social ills or things of that nature. Hence people like Jane Addams, things of that nature. I mean, even though, like you mentioned, DHHS and CHA, they exist, they overwhelmingly, they can't like get in the weeds, which is why they have, they offer subsidies and tax exemptions to nonprofit organizations that can handle those issues better.
Yeah, sure. Yes, very good. Thank you. Mitch?
I mean, I think it's collaborative in a lot of ways. The state government can play a big role, and more on a policy level, but I mean, statewide minimum wage covers the entire state, not just each county. I mean, each county can set their own minimum wages, or towns can set, or cities can set their own minimum wages, but that's part of it. There's a lot of other state resources and then federal that flow through the state as well.
Do you believe me when I tell you there's more poor people in the suburbs than the city?
Yes, because you said most people now live in suburbs in America. So
Very good.
Depends
Makes
on
sense.
which suburbs. Depends on which suburbs you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Harvey and
But they're less
Dixmoor.
concentrated, which creates obstacles to providing services.
Absolutely. So who said Harvey and Dixmoor?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, yeah, if you're talking Harvey, Dixmoor, Riverdale, those type of places, yes, definitely poor, super poor. But then if you start talking like, Olympia Fields or Richmond Park, or you start going further out, the money kind of grows.
So it's segregated. The suburbs are segregated again. And if you look at the patterns that Connie talked about, what Pierre Devise talked about, sort of the south and west sides, we see the same pattern in the suburbs, right? The poorer suburbs are these inner rung, sort of Maywood, Bellwood, Berkeley area, and then these southern suburbs, Harvey, Dolton, Riverdale, there as well. So the west and the south side. Scott?
I was just going to comment, like I'd mentioned in the chat, I have a friend out in Downers Grove who is in that situation for health reasons and such. And I think also what you run into is the nature of the poverty changes, because I think, like was mentioned in one of the readings, how you could have somebody that says, they say asset rich and cash poor, though that doesn't necessarily mean that they can, convert that asset like a house to cash in a depressed market.
Yes, yeah, right. And especially with COVID, right? That sort of situation is probably more prevalent, especially in the ring of counties around Cook. Barbara Rose talks about that in her article, Poverty in DuPage, what poverty looks like, and what we expect to see when we see impoverished people. In the city, right, we have mental maps, right? We know the poor areas, and we sort of, if I say a poor area of Chicago, you all probably have an immediate, or poor area of New York, poor area of Los Angeles. You all probably have an immediate sort of idea, dilapidated housing, garbage, people begging for money. In the suburbs, in DuPage County particularly, you don't see the same sort of thing, right? People are sleeping in their cars, they're double, tripled up in homes. So what poverty looks like is really different. I mention this because addressing poverty then becomes more difficult. How do you convince a legislator, hey, this is an important thing for us to consider, especially in DuPage? When like, no, that's Cook County, right? That's the city. That's not out here. It's hard, but poverty in DuPage has doubled in the past 20 years. The amount of people in extreme poverty has doubled. And it doesn't look necessarily the same. Poverty is whiter in DuPage County. That's because DuPage County is whiter. More single mothers are, poverty statistics in general, it is more single mothers, but it's more skewed that way in DuPage County. And so the fact that it looks different means that people's ideas, their propositions or ways of dealing with it are different. People say, not in DuPage County, right? It's not poor. 1/3 of students at COD qualify as hungry. 1/3. We have a student population of about 25,000. I was shocked when I heard that statistic, right? I went to Triton, some poor communities that go to Triton, but 1/3 of those students qualify, but you wouldn't think so, right? And the mentality sort of in DuPage County is that we want a lean, clean government, and we're not going to get involved in that. So that can exacerbate poverty and leave people with little resources. What's the point? The point is a regional solution, right, might help us address some of these problems. I apologize, this is the ugliest one, I promise. A lot of the literature, I think that the literature sort of moved away from regional governance or metropolitan governance, but for a long time, especially like in the early 2000s, this was very popular wing sort of urban literature. A lot of these regional government types running around at conferences like APSA and MPSA, you'll still find them. But they sort of made the argument that a regional government would be able to address some of these issues. Right? We need large scale and long-term investments like the CTA, like the RTA. And so if we had a regional solution, we might be able to handle it. Oak Park and Berwyn are the same economic market. Why not work together? The duplicated services could be reduced, and then we could start talking about revenue sharing and deconcentrating poverty and all the lovely things that go with that. So what I want to know from you is what you think of regional governance, what you think of metropolitan governance, and if this is potentially a solution to the problems that Chicago and Illinois face. Daniel.
I have a question. How
Sure.
strong are how powerful are county governments in Illinois?
So the answer is pretty powerful. You can apply for home rule. Cook County and I don't know if DuPage County has home rule. They're essentially subdivisions of state government, right? The idea is that they give out services from the state. So the court system, right, is organized by county. Your birth certificate is organized by county. Can they tax? They can tax, they can spend. So that's part of their power as well. Can they make policy? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I guess so. Again, I come from Texas politics, and Texas counties are really, really powerful. The budget for Harris County is larger than 12 states. And so that regional response, and I think the counties are also geographically larger.
Yes.
The regional response is often coordinated at the county level. So I'm just trying to position the situation here within the context of the political environment with which I'm familiar.
One of the things, Daniel, that's different here is the counties cannot make laws that affect the municipalities and township citizens.
Oh,
Or at least municipalities. So for instance, Cook County can make any law it wants to apply to unincorporated areas, which are only 250,000 people on the biggest day. They can't make a single law that affects Chicagoans in that kind of direct way. They can give out services, they can do other things, but they have some strict limits on their ability. So if you're going to be, the speed limit is governed not by the county, but it's governed by the city, to just give a simple example. So when you see a 30-mile-an-hour speed zone, that's a city or municipality, or conceivably a state if it's a state highway, but it's never the county. The county doesn't have speed zones,
So, yeah,
except
like
in unincorporated areas, which are, so that's not a perfect answer, but that gives you a sense of the restrictions.
for instance, when the hurricane natural disasters declared in Texas, the 7-county metropolitan area around Houston immediately reverts to the control of the Harris County judge, who basically becomes dictator for the period of the emergency. So I'm accustomed to a much stronger regional structure. This is interesting.
Well, so that might be a solution, right? To do something like that in the for Cook and the Collars is to, we are one of the most fragmented states in the union, right? So that might be what you might be hitting on is a potential solution. Ryan?
Yeah, I was going to respond to the question that you posed about whether or not regional governance can mitigate some of these problems of duplicity in government, bureaucracy, and things like that I think that, from my perspective at least, the regional government kind of already exists, and I think it's more the state. So I think about something like, I'm from California. I grew up in LA. I'm very familiar with the problems in LA, and especially around housing and zoning laws and NIMBYism that prevents development basically anywhere from happening. And I think about, what finally had to happen when you had the city of LA fighting with Long Beach, who fought with Huntington Beach, who fought with Redondo about who should build more housing. Is the state government finally stepped in and just recently passed a law that would eliminate single family zoning. So duplexes have to be allowed everywhere in the state. And I think about, if you applied that to Illinois, if you have, some of these wealthier counties like DuPage and others in the Chicago metropolitan area, I think the big difference for them going forward, if you were to put them into a regional government, the behavioral responses will matter greatly, right? If they can easily escape, because they don't want, like you said, if they have high incomes, they don't want to pay higher taxes to support people in Cook County that they don't know, that they probably look down upon, et cetera, et cetera. If they can figure out ways to escape from this regional government, then I could imagine a scenario where whatever boundaries you draw just outside of those boundaries become very, very valuable. But if it's the whole state, I guess that it just makes it a little bit more difficult to avoid. So I would think that state government should be coming in with a little bit more of a iron fist here in terms of taking coordination of a lot of these things that are listed here: public transportation, airports, harbors, schools, universities. So that would be my inclination for this.
That's interesting. I think California is probably better at that than Illinois. Most states are better at a lot of things, government-wise, than Illinois. But particularly, right, with education, moving to a state, but you're right, the will, right, where is the will? Moving to a state or a more even sort of state funding could alleviate a lot of the problems here. But the will, what's interesting about California is they have the Lakewood plan. Los Angeles County sells its services, such as police, fire, and that sort of stuff to municipalities who don't want to create their own, which does help, right? That's it helps create some efficiencies some way. I think in Illinois, again, we have such multiplication. We even have forest preserve police. It's a different crime in the forest preserve. I don't know, right? So, yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Mitch?
I mean, doesn't a lot of this just come down to the fact that this is all resource for the machine? I mean, the more pieces of government you have, and I say this because I worked on an All-America campaign when I was in high school, and I remember one day we were working on the All-America campaign, but then we got sent down to University Park to help, campaign or canvas on a race there. And so, I mean, if you have this massive organization, if you're helping your allies out and winning their local races, it just seems like this is all the fragmentation is just like a symptom of the machine.
Of course it is. Yeah, so there's a lot of books that I had to read for my urban prelims that said things like debt limits and self-determination. But I do think, and having worked for a very machine alderman, and living in areas that have a lot of machine, I do think that does explain a lot of it. Having multiple units of governments provides jobs, right? How are you going to reward your friends? What does Vito Marzullo say? He wants to reward his friends and screw his enemies. How do you do that if you don't have anything to give out? So yes, a very good point indeed about that. I'm watching the time. I guess I can wrap up here and leave time for questions. Some areas of the country have tried to solve their metropolitan issues by creating different strategies, right? So in California, we have the Lakewood Plan, as I mentioned. In Florida, Miami-Dade County has merged so that some functions only the county does, and then the municipalities are allowed to do some other things. In Portland, they have, the county has an authority that does urban planning. So they have a urban growth boundary inside of which you can't build, right? That combines all of the growth inside of that boundary. And so they make the decisions together. Minneapolis, St. Paul have a relationship and a board that make decisions for them. So there's examples out there. New York used to be 5 cities, right? In 1898, it became 1 city, but still is 5 cities masquerading as one. So there's examples out there. I think that you all have done a really good job of hitting on a lot of the issues. Number one, there's the idea of metropolitan citizen does not exist. Number 2, the will to get rid of, right? The governments, it's somebody's job, that's somebody's patronage. And then also sort of the identity part of it. It's easier to leave things the way that they are. So it's up to you guys, right? All 20, the lot of you, 20 some odd of you to sort of figure that out, right? I get to sit in my cushy desk in Glen Ellen and just throw these problems out to you. It's up to you guys to sort of figure that out.
Maybe we can take the last few minutes and any questions that have come up or ideas that have come up so far in the course, and maybe Missy can answer all of them for you.
I can, all of them.
Well, it's a lot to take in, particularly if you're not from Chicago and a native here, to try and learn all of it. Mitch, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, and I don't know if we'll cover this at all in some of the books or whatnot, but has there been any recollection of like the spheres of influence of Chicago on the suburbs? Like, is there like a mapping of this, like a historical mapping of it? And, I'm just curious now that, we see a lot of like the major, machine type of figures falling, what are the implications for some of those suburbs that, are the suburbs going to still be their own little machine fiefdoms? I'm just curious if we have like any kind of recollection of like the influence of Chicago on some of these other areas over time, and how that's changed.
Pretty sure I'm going to take next summer off and do that and write that. That needs to be written, that sort of spiderweb out of the machine into the suburbs. No, I'm looking for it. If I find it, I will let you know. That's an excellent question, though. Yeah.
Generally speaking, the suburbs have been less well studied throughout the United States and the rest of the world than the central cities. So the literature on the cities goes back hundreds of years, but the literature on the suburbs is very spotty. That's why particularly the work that Connie and Missy do is so important. And it is, there are others in the Chicago School who do focus on suburbs, but it's a literature that's being written.
Because one of the things I notice is it seems like there's a lot of corruption cases coming out of like those collar suburbs too, or most recently with the red light cameras, but just a lot of other things too.
Oh, yeah.
So, and is that, I wonder if, to your point, Professor Simpson, is that like a function of the fact that it's easier to slip those things under the eye, the watchful eye, whereas, in Chicago, you can't really do that. It's hard, there's more people watching.
Well, when we studied the suburbs and corruption, we found 60 suburbs with 300 cases of corruption that ended up in federal prison, where people went to federal prison for them. So yes, there is a huge amount of corruption, and it's not all the kind that you hear about from classically, like from Cicero or the stories like that. But it is understudied. I think ours is the only article that's ever been written on the suburban corruption in Illinois.
It doesn't get the same
Mostly
media
anywhere.
coverage. Yeah, who cares what's going on in East Hazel Crest or Dixmoor, right? Unless someone runs away with $25 million and builds a horse farm. So these sensational stories make it. There's probably a lot of stuff that flies under the radar because we don't have, there's Chicago papers. We don't have local papers that cover it as much.
And the suburbs don't have a single inspector general in all of the suburbs in the Chicago region. The sheriff of Cook County has offered to be the inspector general for each suburb. There are 129 municipalities in Cook County. And so far, only 10 have agreed to any form of inspector general work by the sheriff, even though they wouldn't pay for it. It would be free. That is a function that the state should take over. The state should set up an inspector general for all suburbs because they can't afford inspector generals on their own.
It's telling too that the suburbs won't take them up on a free offer.
I'm just another kind of curiosity. Has there been any like tracking of financials, like campaign finances moving from, city type of candidates, state level, federal, local to suburban, whether, and I guess you kind of lose stuff if it goes into a PAC, but has there been any kind of tracing of that kind of thing?
I think that, again, the fact that there's 129 of us makes it difficult. So there's no main database of, that's something else I can do next summer, I suppose. There's no main database simply of that stuff. Illinois Sunshine does a good job, like during the municipal elections in April, they did a really good job of publishing that stuff. But the thing about municipal elections is that they're in April, and so people they can wait to get their donations until January, February, March. So don't know that stuff until election time. And then after the election, it's not that people don't care, but they're exhausted from running, or it's been a tough race. And so they just sort of want to put it behind them. And so local people do follow, where I live, there's a lot of community activists who sort of follow the money and look at this stuff, but there is no one database for it all. So if you guys want to grow up and be a suburbanist, lots of stuff for you to do.
With that, I think we'll end it for this week. Thank you very much, Missy, for being with us and for doing the book 21st Century Chicago. And we will reconvene next week and start looking at the city revisited to get some more theoretical background and to look at the difference between us and Los Angeles and New York, which some of you know pretty well and will be able to help us with. So see you next week here at the same Zoom station.